A big twist in a high-profile case out of Lake Tahoe. We have now learned that a man accused of attacking his in-laws, killing one, was apparently having an affair with his alleged co-conspirator, his nanny. It is a complex web of alleged deceit and lies, and we're combing through it all for you right now. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. We first told you about this wild case back in February. This is when a woman named Samantha Scott entered a guilty plea to a felony accessory charge in relation to the killing of Robert Gary Spoor, who sometimes goes by Gary, and also the attempted murder of his wife, Wendy Wood. Now, she's going to face sentencing later this year, could get up to 3 years in prison, but for now, she's not in custody. Now, in return for her guilty plea, Scott has to testify against Danny Serafini, a former Major League Baseball pitcher who is accused of killing his wife's father and seriously injuring her mother. And during the years-long investigation, as police pieced together who was allegedly involved and eventually settled on Serafini and Scott, they weren't sure of how these two were even connected, or at least they didn't say so publicly. The only connection known when we first reported on this story was that Scott had been close friends with Serafini's wife, Erin Spoor, who at one point worked as the couple's nanny. However, it has now been revealed that Serafini and Scott were allegedly having an affair. Yeah, prosecutors allege that this illicit relationship between the two is what led Scott to drive Serafini to his in-laws' house. According to court paperwork that was reviewed by the Daily Mail, Scott admitted to police that she and Serafini spent the night together at a motel in Elko, Nevada. Then she says she drove him to Tahoe City, a trip that would have taken more than 6 hours driving. The Daily Mail, citing court documents and testimony, that Scott first told investigators she was still back in Elko, Nevada when the home invasion happened, but she changed her tune when she was confronted with cell phone GPS records. If that allegation is true, yeah, it's not the first time somebody has changed their tune when confronted with that evidence. So she then claimed that she didn't know what Serafini was going to do and that he insisted on being dropped off at a spot called Fat Cat Bar and Grill, saying he needed to pick up a package. She then apparently picked him up a few hours later and drove back to Nevada. Now, Scott reportedly said that she and Serafini had this, quote, flirtatious, romantic relationship, stopping short of calling it an outright affair, but it seems that's what it was. And that's not the only piece of bombshell evidence that jurors will hear at this trial. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. But first, got to give you a little bit of backstory to catch up on how all this went down. So on June 5th, 2021, authorities say a masked and hooded gunman entered the home of 70-year-old Robert Spoor and 68-year-old Wendy Wood, shooting both of them. Robert was killed. Wendy actually survived 2 shots to the head. Her daughter, Adrian, would later tell reporters that she actually managed to dial 911 on her phone. She spent months recovering, learning how to do practically everything over again, but Adrian says Wendy never really got over Robert's death, and in a sad turn of events, she ended up taking her own life around a year later. Adrian says the family blames the shooter for Wendy's death, too. So the Placer County Sheriff's Office released surveillance video from outside the home and nearby, showing a man, his face covered, moving up the Spoor's driveway on the day of the shooting. Officials say he laid in wait for the couple and then opened fire. Officials hoped the security footage would generate new leads, but the case seemed to be going cold. And then in 2022, the Spoor family offered a $150,000 reward for anyone who could provide information that led to the arrest and conviction of the shooter. But it would be another year before deputies had a suspect in custody. Well, in fact, 2 suspects. Scott and Serafini were arrested in separate Nevada cities in 2023, flown back to California to face charges. They both entered not guilty pleas to multiple charges, but then earlier this year it was announced that Scott had entered a guilty plea to violation of Penal Code Section 32, which is the statute covering being an accessory to a felony after the fact. According to investigators, Scott said she'd given Serafini a ride on the day of the shooting, but Scott's lawyer maintained that there was no evidence that Scott actively participated in the killing itself, so Scott pleaded guilty a few months back to being an accessory. Now, Serafini has maintained his not guilty plea. The trial is getting underway in California. According to Placer County court records, Serafini faces 4 felony counts: felony murder with the aggravating factors of lying in wait and personal discharge of a firearm for Robert's death, attempted felony murder in connection with Wendy's terrible injuries, first-degree burglary that involves great bodily injury to an elderly victim, and child abuse or endangerment. And the details surrounding that last charge still unclear, but we have some ideas about what that might be. We'll discuss it too. But prosecutors allege that Serafini, who at one point owned a bar with his wife Erin in Nevada that was featured on the reality show, by the way, Bar Rescue, have had many problems over the years, financial issues. And they say Serafini may have killed his in-laws in a plot to get his hands on some of their money through his wife. Erin, though, to be clear, has not been charged in connection with the attack on her parents. I want to make that very clear. Now, Serafini's name might be familiar if you're a baseball fan. He pitched for 6 different teams between 1996 and 2007, including the Minnesota Twins and the Chicago Cubs. His career in the United States ended in 2007 after he tested positive for performance-enhancing drugs. This is according to outlet KRCA, but they also report that he continued playing baseball out in Mexico. So, to talk about the big twists revealed during a final pretrial hearing for Serafini's trial, I want to bring in Jeremy Evans, a sports entertainment and media attorney. Jeremy, so good to see you. Thanks so much for taking the time. What stands out to you about this case? What stands out to you about some of the new developments I mentioned?
No, it's great to be on with you, Jesse. And I think for me, the biggest thing is that Scott is going to testify. So it sounds like to me she's brokered a deal with the prosecution to essentially get a lighter sentence. I think that's one of the big things. I think the second thing is that a weapon has not been found. So, generally, you have this sort of evidence that leads to, a conviction. But I think in this case, the fact that the weapon hasn't been found, they're going to have to make sure to find that, that the person in the video was actually Serafini. So there's ways to tell that, and I'm sure they can do some things with artificial intelligence and investigation to figure that out. But that's sort of a second thing. I think those two things are really the big ones for me. I think that maybe a third thing would be the fact is that she changed her story. I think when she's cross examined on the stand, there's going to be some very harsh questioning there as to why she changed her story. But also, if she did not know that something was happening in terms of a felony, there's potential that she could be excused from those charges as well for accessory after the fact. Those are the three big things for me.
You know, Jeremy, we actually hear about arrests in criminal cases involving current and former star athletes often. You know, they're human beings. They're living a life just as anybody else. Maybe it's amplified because of that celebrity status, but why do you think that is?
It's such a good question. I think ultimately what this really boils down to is the fact that a lot of the times when you're a professional athlete, you got to figure that if you don't have a good upbringing and you're not around parents or coaches that are teaching you well and sort of humbling you, I think there's tendency that from a young age you're really told that you're the best thing in the world, which is not a bad thing, but it's got to be done with some humility, right? So I think that a lot of times these athletes get into a place where from age 6, 7 years old, when they're starting to play whatever sport they're playing, they're being told, you're the best, you're the best, you're so good at this. A lot of times they're getting things for free or complimentary. People treat them differently. I think, and then of course, when you combine that with millions of dollars, I think Serafini had made, I think somewhere upwards of $14 million in his career, but I think it was about $300,000 in debt. There needs to be some financial education there too. I think this is really some of the problems that we're seeing with college sports as well these days, where you need to have the financial education alongside of, obviously your professional, education and
Right.
real life experience. Yeah.
That's really, really well said because sometimes I always wonder, is there a backup plan? Is that emphasized enough? Your career is only going to go so far, whether it's through injury, testing positive for, performance enhancing drugs, whatever it may be. There's that backup plan, and I wonder, the emphasis on education, the emphasis on a life after baseball, football, basketball, whatever it may be. That seems to be an issue.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it needs to be addressed. I know some of the sports leagues have done a pretty good job of inserting financial education and making sure people have real life experience. And especially, you got to figure a lot of these athletes are getting drafted, 17, 18 years old, and they're being given, large amounts of money. I don't know about you, Jesse, but when I was 17, 18 years old, I don't know what I would have done with, millions of dollars. Probably wouldn't have been
I,
financially
I,
responsible.
I probably would have bought like the real life or the replica like Ghostbuster proton gun. That's always what I wanted. Never got it, but yeah, that's a separate story. Yeah, yeah. No, look, not to take away from this. I don't know. Look, we don't know if these allegations are true, but when you think about financial issues, you think about a former star athlete. It's a fair question to be asking. So I want to get a little bit more into this. I want to talk about Serafini's alleged lover, Samantha Scott. So first, Serafini's alleged lover, Samantha Scott, as we've been talking about, is apparently going to be testifying against him, while get this, his wife Erin apparently plans to testify in his defense. That is according to court paperwork reviewed by the Daily Mail. So first of all, talk about a potentially very tense courtroom situation. I can't say, Jeremy, I've seen something like that before.
No, I have not either. Normally, in this circumstance, the wife would stay out of it and not involve herself in it. So that is very fascinating that she's going to testify on his behalf, even despite the fact that the allegation is that Danny killed her father, and then not only that, but that he was in a romantic relationship with another woman. Just I personally have never seen anything like that before. Generally, the victims or the victim's family would stay out of it. Now, the interesting part to this too is just as Scott is going to be vigorously cross-examined, the same is going to happen with the wife, and so that's going to be an interesting thing to watch
Right.
on the stand. Yeah.
So that will be interesting for sure. And I will tell you this, the Daily Mail reports that Serafini's wife and children, they were visiting with Robert and Wendy, left not long before the shooting. Outlet SF Gate reports that Erin and the kids, they were spending time with their grandparents at a nearby lake when Serafini allegedly entered the home, hid, waited for his in-laws to return. That seems to me what could be the child endangerment charge, right? Potentially putting his own children in danger with this alleged hit. You think I'm totally off base?
No, that's exactly what it is. The sort of definition and the elements of the crime for kidnapping or for child endangerment are fairly similar in the sense that if you're using a deadly weapon, any sort of force, even if the kids were unaware as to what was going on, which sort of makes sense, it's their father, right? But that's clearly an endangerment piece where he's got an intention to do something. And by the way, another key factor in this is the 6 hours that it takes to drive from Elko to Lake Tahoe, because that is sort of the idea to show the element of the crime for premeditation. He had a long time to think about this on that drive, and of course, you have to imagine that that's where the prosecution is going in doing accessory after the fact with Scott. But yeah, I think you're right on target.
And then documents from the prosecution also reportedly revealed that Serafini had allegedly spoken ill of his in-laws before, especially in reference to money. In 2012, the same year that he married Erin, Serafini was reportedly heard offering $20,000 to have the couple murdered. In 2016, the prosecution says Serafini was heard calling his in-laws wealthy pieces of S. According to KCRA, Erin previously revealed at Serafini's preliminary hearing that on the day of the shooting, Wendy gave her a $90,000 check. So this wealthy couple over the years had also reportedly been paying for Serafini's home in Reno, daycare for their two children, baby supplies, schools, vacations, a $55,000 car. Jeremy, when you think about any murder case or alleged murder case or attempted murder case, you think about, are there any enemies? Who would want to do this? Is this a random attack? When you hear this, who would attack this elderly couple? The pieces start adding together. Now, look, he is innocent until proven guilty. He will have an opportunity to defend himself, but this doesn't look good.
No, it looks terrible. And I think the point we talked about earlier with the long drive, he has time to think about it. I think the point that even though it seems minor, but the idea that he was willing to break the baseball rules and policy with regard to taking steroids, his ability to basically make upwards of $14 million and then turn around and then essentially not have any money to speak of. And I think the other piece in here is interesting from a psychological standpoint. The idea that he was blaming his wife's parents for being wealthy and then not sort of paying for his and his wife's lifestyle, even though he had lost money and had been irresponsible. It's that piece we talked about earlier, that sort of lack of self reflection. I think that is going to hurt him in this case.
But the defense could say, hey, this guy and his family, they were very dependent on Robert and Wendy. Why would he attack them?
Right. It's funny because I think I've sort of seen this story before where psychologists will even talk about the idea that sometimes you go after the person who's treated you the best only because you feel a level of resentment there that somebody's taking care of you, and that it's a weird dynamic, but we've seen that I think many times before in these types of cases.
Now, Erin was also shown the surveillance video of the alleged shooter outside of her parents' home during that preliminary hearing and testified that the man in the video was not Serafini. According to the Daily Mail's review of court documents, just a few months before the murder, or alleged murder in June of 2021, a foreman at a mining operation in Nevada where Serafini was working says he overheard Serafini saying he wanted to kill Robert and Wendy after he got off a furious phone call. So Jeremy, an alternative suspect always maybe has the jury perking up their ears a little bit. Show us
Yeah.
somebody else. The defense doesn't have a burden to prove that someone else did this, right? But at the same time, it definitely tells an interesting story that, Serafini may have had issues with Robert and Wendy, and that, if he did commit this crime, it was, likely not something spur of the moment, but could it be somebody else?
Yeah, no, to your point, Jesse, I mean, the weapon has not been found. The video has not been totally secured that it was Serafini. And so to your point, the defense's really sole argument is there's no weapon found, nothing tying Serafini to the murder. But then also too, the idea of sort of putting up the straw man defense that there may be this other person out there. So yeah, really good point, and I agree.
And look, there is a big update, though, on evidence that the prosecution plans to present to the jury. Okay, so there are flirty messages that went back and forth between Serafini and his alleged co-conspirator, Samantha Scott. But there's also a string of emails that Serafini reportedly sent to his in-laws that the judge in this case, Judge Garen Horst, called, quote, intense, verbally violent interactions. So, Jeremy, having something in writing is key. And I think that can also be quite problematic for Mr. Serafini.
Agreed completely, and I think that would go to like habit, and his personality and how he dealt with them in the past. So completely agree with you. And I think for Scott's situation, again, she's going to be vigorously cross-examined because ultimately in this case, she's sort of getting a deal to sort of defend him. But I don't think the jury is going to look very lightly upon her. They're going to, I think they're going to be very judgmental of her based on her situation, the fact that she was in a relationship with a married person, and then also the fact that she cut a deal to basically get out of the accessory charge. So
Yeah.
it's going to be a tough uphill battle for both of these folks.
And I didn't even get to maybe the biggest twist of all. So we previously reported that Adrian Spoor had said that, her mother's recovery not only was intense, but following the attack, she had no memory of what happened. But according to the prosecution, as reported by the Daily Mail, Wendy Wood actually recovered her memory. And because of that, had changed her will, cutting out Serafini and Erin and leaving the family's fortune, reportedly $10 million, according to SF Gate, to Adrian. So, Jeremy, not only have we been talking about tension, not only have we been talking about alleged financial difficulties, but now we're talking about a pure, clear-cut alleged motive to kill. Now, again, innocent until proven guilty. Prosecution doesn't have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt a motive. It helps tell a story. And what better story than money? My gosh.
No, I completely agree. It sort of shows again that psychological piece where they're in this place where they don't have money, they're relying on somebody to pay for things, and then sort of going after the person who's taking care of them. I think another piece in this too, Jesse, is this idea that is there potential that, and maybe because it was too hard for the prosecution to bring this case, but the causation between the mother committing suicide and her being shot earlier and then seeing her husband die. So that may not be enough for a criminal charge, but definitely a civil case down the road for intentional infliction of distress or something like that.
Jeremy, there's actually legal action being reported between the two sisters over their parents' estate. It's been put on pause until the criminal trial's over. What do you make of that?
Well, I think sadly, this is something we see all the time with regard to families arguing over, and especially in a situation where you have such a tragedy happening and the two sisters fighting over. And it makes sense. I mean, you have probably the one sister saying, you know, not the wife of Serafini, saying, why are you testifying on behalf of this guy who allegedly killed, our father and at least causally, killed our mother. So it definitely, I could see the tension there, and it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, thankfully the mother survived, but my gosh, I mean, you have a situation here where it's like, it's tense to say the least. And, by the way, we also learned a little bit about what the defense will say, mainly that Mr. Serafini wasn't the only one who had beef with Robert and Wendy. So I go back to the question I said before, who were enemies of this couple? Well, I'll tell you what, the Daily Mail reports that the two had been referred to as, quote, nightmare neighbors. They had multiple restraining orders out against them. Wendy was reportedly convicted in 2018 of attacking a man with a paddleboard for fishing outside her home. Robert had been involved in a number of court cases too. Jeremy, that is interesting. That is interesting.
It is. And I think that that's the one piece that I think maybe, again, the defense could bring up potentially is what sort of relationship did they have? Was he involved in some sort of shady business dealings? So again, I think to your point that that's sort of very interesting. I think another key piece of evidence too is the fact that Serafini had told Scott that he had dropped off or needed to drop off a package. And I wonder if that was just sort of some sort of concealed sort of talk towards dropping off the gun or getting rid of the evidence, or who or whatever it was, or maybe it was even a situation where Serafini paid somebody. But I will tell you that I think generally in these criminal cases, when you have somebody who's willing to go into a home and sit around for a while, that is either an issue of um, some sort of psychotic behavior, or somebody who's psychotic but also knows the family and sort of could have access and that sort of thing. So
And who's
very, very
committed.
interesting.
And who's committed to doing it. I mean, that's the lying in wait that's, incredibly chilling in those kind of cases. But by the way, the defense has also pointed out that Serafini wasn't the only one who could have benefited financially from this couple's deaths. What am I talking about? The idea of the finger being pointed at Adrian, the daughter, also stood to inherit. So defense attorneys revealed that Adrian is currently dating a convicted bank robber. So now I wonder if it could backfire in the sense, for the defense to point to alternative suspects, neighbors, Adrian. It's something for the jury to consider, but is it too much for them to consider? Is it, you're just now pointing the finger at anybody? Although, I mean, that's interesting to think about. Someone else maybe had something to gain by the parents dying.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's probably too much. I think it's not generally a good idea to point fingers at the victim's family in this case, but it is a good point. I think probably the defense's best chance is to point at the fact that there's no clear video evidence that it was Serafini and the weapon was not found. And then
Mm.
thirdly, to point at, basically somebody else who had did this. That's really sort of, I think, the best case scenario for the defense.
Well, I'll tell you what, opening statements in Mr. Serafini's trial are slated to start next week. The trial could last several weeks. This is according to outlet SF Gate. And I'll tell you, he faces life in prison if he's convicted, so the stakes could not be higher. Jeremy, so good seeing you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
A pleasure. Thank you, Jesse.
And that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.